Erev Tov, everyone. Despite what you may or may not have heard, there's no such thing as the Jewish law. There's no single, in fact, the word in Hebrew for Jewish law is halacha, which literally means the path or the way. So there's no one single set of practices. And if you hear somebody, which some will say, oh, to be orthodox is to follow the Shulchan Aruch, which is hearkening back to what we've learned in the last classes, we've learned that even the Shulchan Aruch from the 16th century, there's no such thing as following the Shulchan Aruch. If someone means they follow the Shulchan Aruch, what they means is that based on the Shulchan Aruch and all of the many commentaries, based on your family's geographic tradition and the many responses from local rabbis and case studies and everything and local customs, based on all of that, you follow the Shulchan Aruch. But the point is that Jewish law is ever changing. Certainly there are some consistent principles, et cetera, like that. But what we really explored over the last several classes, and this is in no way a culmination, it's just to kind of put into context what we're learning tonight. If you go back to Moshe in the wilderness, when people had a question about what does God want, what is the practice, that was somewhat possible. You ask Moshe about a certain case, and there are examples of this in the Torah. Moshe asks God and then makes the ruling. In that case, you know that that is indeed the ruling. After Moshe, it kind of passes on to the prophets. Now, the prophets don't really give over law or rulings or commandments, mitzvot, the way Moshe does. But one of the key things is, for the most part, however the people are practicing is pretty centralized. Now, again, throughout the early history of our people in Israel, there's a lot of warring kingdoms and tribes, etc. But strictly speaking, you could say that in the land of Israel, generally Jewish practice, and again, this is oversimplifying, was more or less centralized. And you had, long before the rabbis, a kind of central, after the prophets, you had central sages and leaders, and more or less what they said as the practice was the accepted practice. Do people follow it? No, they worship idols, but it was a general centralization. But then, through the first exile, the second destruction of the temple, people being sent all over the world, you basically lost all of centralization, to the point where you had two master magnum opuses of the discussions around Jewish law, two different Talmuds, and then generations of commentaries on it. And what you basically had to do is each different community had to decide how to apply everything before them. The one kind of general principle that a lot of people tried to do is majority rules. Let me look at everything before me, and based on what most people are doing around where I geographically am, how do most people in Orthodox people in Milwaukee practice? That's what I'm going to do. And that's been one of the more consistent and common traits of Jewish law throughout history is, what are most people doing around where I live? And every few generations, you have Jews spreading out more and more and more, their leadership being either destroyed or displaced by war, etc. So the number of practices become broken apart. And you can't just say, well, let's look at our unified area and say, what are they doing in Wisconsin? Because people are spread all over. So every few generations, you had a rabbi like Rambam in his Mishnah Torah who said, I'm going to take everything before me and compile it into an easily accessible book of Jewish law that everyone can look to, and we'll have one unified, centralized code of Jewish law. And it did not backfire per se, but it was heavily criticized, even burned. And people said, how dare you? Everybody has different practices. What makes you think you know the right one? You don't even know what they're doing on the other side of the world. So what people did is, instead of throwing it out, they took it and said, I'm going to fix your mistakes. And in fact, we'll read about that in one of the articles here about one rabbi who actually went to the Mishnah Torah, went through it and said, wrong, wrong, wrong. Okay, I see your point. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And then over the next centuries, people just built on it and built on it and built on it until you had, as I said in previous classes, so many different compilations and opinions that it was impossible to know how one is to practice. And then eventually this pattern of trying to create one compiled, and again, there are many rabbis who have tried to do this, focus it into one practical ruling that people can look at, and then it explodes with people tearing it apart, commenting on it, disagreeing with it, and then back together. In the 16th century, you had that in the Shulchan Aruch from a Sephardic rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and at the same time, Rabbi Moshe Isserles came along, and he basically said, you completely ignored the hundreds of years of Ashkenazi rabbis, but instead of throwing out your work, I'm going to add my notes, and together we're going to have one work that Jews all over the European world can follow. And it was pretty darn popular and successful. But again, they still left out a lot. So you had the next number of generations to today of people commenting on the Shulchan Aruch saying, you forgot this rabbi, or this is clearly a mistake. If you had seen this text from 100 years before you were born, you never would have said that. And then finally, you get to the late 19th century, early 20th century. And again, you have this insane proliferation of practices all over Europe. And into it come two great rabbis who want to create a practical guide to Jewish law that people can sit down and say, oh, now I know what to do on Sukkot. Both of them took very different approaches, and we will read about that. But the one that we're going to focus on is this gentleman here. His name, or his popular name, is actually the Chofetz Chayim, literally one who desires life. And I'll explain a little more why later, but that's the name of one of his works on the laws of gossip. But his long form name, and this is actually his signature here, is Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan. And the truth is, we actually don't know a lot about his early life. I'm going to share a little bit of biographic information on what we think we do know. But this man, even though he was one of the most prolific and truly brilliant writers of his generation, we don't know a lot about his early life. And most of what we know, we have to recreate and guess out of what he wrote. And what's interesting is if you pick up a biography from one of the popular Jewish publishers that write about him, they'll include the stuff I'm about to say, but a lot of stuff that may or may not have happened. There are a lot of legends about him. And just because it's a legend does not mean it's not true. But a lot of people like Midrash take it to be quite the literal truth. And I'm going to generally steer away from that. I might mention one because I thought it was kind of cute. But other than that, I'm going to try and stick to what we do know. So what I'll do is we'll do a general biography of him and his life, more or less from beginning to end. And then again, focusing on what we do know, there's an incredible article that talks about his work of Jewish law, how he wrote it, what was his methodology that he went into, because it explains a great deal about how he understands Jewish law. And that's so key. If someone says there's one clear Jewish law that we can trace back to Moses and the Torah, they have no idea what they're talking about. But to admit that Jewish law is complicated, and the goal is not to find the correct practice, but rather to find some sort of compromise, some sort of reasonable solution, and even to mention that there's more than one valid way to do it, that's really the best we can do. And this great man, that's more or less what he did. The other rabbi who was brilliant, and his work is still very authoritative, for a lot of reasons, never got as popular as this rabbi. And it's not 100% clear why. I'll mention it a little bit more in context. But without further ado, let's learn a little bit more about this great man who was known as being incredibly humble and pious. But again, a lot of it is legendary. But what we do know is the incredible works that he wrote, that when I talked about the Shulchan Aruch, or even earlier works, I said, nobody really picks up the Shulchan Aruch and says, this is the ruling. People will pick up his work of Jewish law, which we'll discuss later, the Mishnah Berurah. People can pick that up and say, oh, this is what I do on Shabbat. His work is incredibly relevant today. Yes, there are other works that might disagree slightly, but his work, and he passed away in the 30s, is still relevant today. So he is very important to Ashkenazi Jews. And I absolutely admit that I am not doing Sephardic rabbis, more because that's not my expertise. So Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan, his birth name was actually Pupko. At some point, it changed to Kagan or Kagan. No one knows why. That's the most I can say about it. He was a Kohen, and it is not uncommon for rabbis who were from the priestly line, who were Kohanim, to include that in his name. But he probably was born as Yisro Meir Pupko. Again, why did he change it? Did he want a less Russian, Slavic-sounding name? He wanted something more Jewish. It is entirely possible, but that's all we know about his name. The second really interesting thing is that for many, many years, if you went into any book about him, or even the internet, and typed in his name, you get a picture of this old-looking rabbi. The problem is, it probably wasn't him. It was probably someone who lived in his town, and maybe his barber. We're not sure, but it almost certainly wasn't him. However, the picture you are looking at here is a colorized, it was originally black and white, colorized from an actual video of him. Again, he passed away in the 30s, so video cameras or film was available. It's him, and it's only very short. We don't hear him talking or anything like that. I didn't bring. You can find the video on YouTube, and it's just a few moments of him just looking like an old rabbi, but it's incredible. This is what he actually looks like. And I think at this point, if you go to Wikipedia and other contemporary articles, you'll find the real video of him. But it's funny, for years, people have pictures of him on their wall, and it's not actually him. So now, where did he come from? So ultimately, he was born in what was the Russian Empire in 1838, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but it's Dyatlava or something like that. And again, a lot of this is a current map. That's where this is a map of like what Europe and Eastern Europe look like today, but you can kind of get a sense of where it was. And again, it was in the Russian Empire, but it's basically in Belarus. And then he passed away in the town of what in the Jews called Radin. I think today it's, I forgot the pronunciation, it's like Rudin or something like that. But he passed away in 1933, which means he lived to be 95 years old. So he lived an incredible life. He was not a great scholar who was cut off in their prime, as many great Jewish scholars were. He had an incredible lifetime of to write works, and he left us an entire library. And in fact, a lot of my library is books written by this great man. So here are some quick facts. So again, we don't really know a lot about his early life. Here are things we do know. When he was 10 years old, his father passed away, and his mother moved him to Vilnius. Now, Vilnius, or Vilna, at that time, certainly before World War II, for the Ashkenazi world, was like the center of Torah learning. If you've ever heard of the Vilna Gaon, which literally the genius of Vilna, or the Gra, was centered in that town and was actually important to this rabbi. But Vilnius is where the greatest academies were, and it appears that she moved him there to give him the best education possible. Susan, yes, you just got to go ahead and unmute yourself.
I've heard it called the Jerusalem of Lithuania.
Yes, 100%. That is one of the names of it. Yeah. And obviously in World War II, when the Jews there were killed and it was all destroyed, it was a great loss for our people. And it's interesting, if you look back at 12th, 13th, 14th century, the centers of Torah learning were in Sephardic lands. Rashi, Ramban, and all of those Ritva, all of those great rabbis. But after the Spanish Inquisition, in the late 1400s, great Torah learning really moved to Eastern Europe. And Vilna became one of the main, not the only one, but really one of the main centers. And that's where he got his early education. His mother remarried someone with the last name Epstein, and she moved to this town of Radin. And then at 17, he only stayed in Vilna for 7 years. And by the way, again, there's a lot of mystery. We don't know if he finished and became a rabbi. There's actually some debate about whether he got rabbinic ordination when he finished there, or if he left early to be with his family. But we do know at the age of 17, he married his stepfather's daughter, which the article I read didn't say it this way, but I think that means he married his stepsister. Now, that certainly in Europe, in a small-knit Jewish community, tight-knit Jewish community, that's not so crazy, especially because people can technically marry their first and second cousins, but he married into family. Once he was in that town, he became the rabbi of the town. So as to the debate of whether or not he had formal ordination, either it didn't matter back then and he had as good as it, or he did, and I don't know why people debate it, but he became the rabbi of the town. But that, again, we don't really know so much about it, but it clearly wasn't right for him. His heart was in the yeshiva, was in learning all day long and passing on that Torah. He's a great teacher. So in 1869, and I didn't write the age here, but you can figure out based on him being born in 1838, here in 1869, he stepped down as rabbi of the town, and he opened his own yeshiva. Now, while it was very well respected, it didn't become like a world-class yeshiva until the next generations took it over. And in fact, even here in Milwaukee, the yeshiva here on the east side is known as a Chofetz Chayim yeshiva. So there is some connection historically with that kind of yeshiva, but there are multiple Chofetz Chaim, which again, his nickname, based on one of his most important and early works. There's a connection there. So his brand of learning, his style of yeshiva, and his very name still have great impact today. But he didn't just stay put in his yeshiva. Again, he didn't say, I want to lock myself in a room and learn Torah and never talk to people. He traveled the world. He spread Torah learning. And this is, again, there's still some mystery. We don't know absolutely everything about what he did. We do know that he was an incredibly prominent political figure. And the next thing here is really interesting because he was not a big fan of Zionism, which again, for the most part in Europe, was a very secular movement. There were religious Zionists, but they were few and far between. However, what is known is that he did not publicly, at least at first, say against it. He was known for being humble and not attacking fellow Jews. However, when he was pushed and pushed and pushed, eventually he said, I'm not in support of it. It's really not in line with Jewish values. And I didn't bring the exact quote here, but he basically said it'd be better to lose all of our yeshivas than for Zionism to go forward. So when you pushed his feet to the fire, he was quite against the Zionistic movement. Now, again, what we mean today by anti-Zionism is very different from his opposition to Zionism. But that's going to come up again because his opposition to the political secular movement had nothing to do with his love of the land of Israel. Susan, yeah, I think you're unmuted anyways. Go ahead.
Yeah, the yeshiva, I applied for a job there, and my understanding was that the reason they talk about him is because they like his philosophy, especially the Lashon Hara thing.
Yeah,
was he with Musar? Is that
yeah,
part
so
of
it's funny.
his?
So
Yeah.
I want to clarify. There are some yeshivas in the world that are specifically connected to the original Chofetz Chaim yeshiva. I do not, but I could be wrong. I don't think the one here in Milwaukee is specifically like formally connected with it. But his brand of learning and his philosophy, or they would say his hashkafa, his philosophy in life, is one that inspires me myself. I've learned a great deal of his Torah, and I consider him to be a great and influential scholar on my own life as a rabbi, as well as many others as well. So I don't know if they just adopted it or if there's any formal historical connection, but he was an incredible teacher of ethics. The Musar movement, the ethics movement, it's actually not clear that he was such a big fan of that movement officially, but much of his teaching has been adopted by that movement. That's a separate conversation. That's a little beyond what we're doing here. But I mentioned about Israel, he was against the secular political movement, and that actually influences some of the other things I'll mention here. He was very, very Orthodox. He was very into his Judaism, and he wanted other people to be into his Judaism, and a secular movement did not jive with his brand of orthodoxy. However, in 1925, it came out that he was going to move to Israel, because even though he was against the secular movement to find a secular state, it's the land of Israel. It's a holy place, and other great rabbis have moved there. But because of the association of moving to Israel with the secular movement of Zionism, many great rabbis, I didn't list them here, but many great rabbis said, don't do it. And he didn't. And I don't know if it was heartbreaking or if it was emotional for him to not move to the land of Israel, but he lived the rest of his life in his small town of Radin. Again, he left us an incredible legacy. He kept writing, I think, till very late in his life, but he clearly is a complex man with a lot of deep passions and very respectful of his colleagues and didn't want to rock the boat, as it were. Sometimes humility can go too far, but it's clear that his goal was not to be a huge, groundbreaking figure, but rather to make Torah something which was loved. And one of the ways he did that, he was involved in a political organization called World Agudat Yisrael, which was an organization throughout Europe, which really helped define what Orthodoxy was politically for Ashkenazi Jews. And in fact, in America, we have Agudat Yisrael, which does basically the same thing. Now, that does not mean that they really speak for all of Orthodox Jews, but at least officially and politically, they have a strong voice. And I've met with them before and talked about modern Orthodoxy, or we discussed with one of the representative modern Orthodoxy and ultra Orthodoxy. And at the end of the day, they said a lot of it has to do with, leadership and policy and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily about what the proper law is or a proper Torah life. It's really about, public issues and stuff like that, which, politics and religion get pretty smushed there. But as I said, one of the things about him that was generally well known is that as great as a scholar as he was, his reputation as being a truly righteous and humble man really was one of his greatest traits. But what that led to is all of these stories about him that absolutely could have happened, but there's no way to know which ones are true. So I'm not going to share them, except that it was generally well known that he was a really good, sweet guy. And there are many people, or there are a number of people that said he had a good sense of humor and he was very affable. I'm comfortable saying that those are things that are generally well known and accepted about him. So it's not just that he was a brilliant scholar, he was a really good guy. Because there are rabbis who are brilliant, but you hear about them being, acerbic and not nice, or saying bad things, and it's hard to learn their Torah. But if you pick up any work by the Mishnah, this Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan Pupko, you can feel confident that he wasn't just a good scholar; he was also a good person. And I think that's very important. He put his money where his mouth is. So that's the biography. Before we go on to now looking at one of his greatest works and his methodology, any questions up until now? Beautiful. So he wrote, and again, if you go to Wikipedia or any place, you'll see not countless, but a lot of works. And again, I have a lot of them on my shelf, and many, if not all of them, are available in excellent English. And he wrote works on very specific subjects. He wrote at least 2 works on proper speech. The most famous one is Chofetz Chayim, which comes from a quote in the book of Psalms in Tehillim. It actually says it here in this left one. He wrote that work in 1873, and it says in the Hebrew on the 1, 2, 3, I guess the 4th line, Mi ha'ish hafechetz chayim, who is the man who desires life, will guard his tongue from wicked speech. And so he wrote a work on speech, but he also wrote a work on proper giving of charity. He also wrote a really fun book that I often give to people who are first learning about Judaism, where he goes through all of the commandments from the Torah that are applicable today. Why? There's 613 commandments. They're all important and valuable, but somebody learning how to be an observant Jew doesn't need to learn as much about animal sacrifices. So this work goes through every single mitzvah that is applicable today, and he says the basics of it, the source of it, etc. So it's in English. And it's a really fun little work called the Book of Mitzvot. So he wrote so much. So this is one, I don't know if it was his first work, but it's one of his first works, and it became insanely popular. And while it is known, the reputation of his work on proper speech is that, the extreme is basically never open your mouth. But that's not true. If you actually read through the work, what he really does is he just tries to give you, first of all, he does set up an ideal, but then he says in the real world, try to do your best. Work on trying to not say bad things about people. And if you're around people who are speaking bad, try and let them know that you'd like to not hear it. And if they won't listen, try and just ignore it. He really gets into how do we apply this to our everyday life. There is a criticism of the Chofetz Chaim in all of his works that he lived in an ivory tower and his book was not applicable to the everyday person. That is not true. There are some rulings of him that are maybe a little bit stricter, but he absolutely was aware of what was going on in the streets, and he really tries his best to respond to the needs of the people. And often we'll actually see in one of his rulings where he says, ideally do this, but he totally validates that there is a more lenient opinion. And he often mentions the lenient opinions, and he says, he actually uses this phrase in Hebrew, Baal Nefesh, someone who's mastered their soul. Basically, someone who's trying to be really orthodox, do this practice that's more strict. But it's totally fine to be lenient. There's nothing wrong with it. And that's somebody who is responding to the needs of the people in the street. Now, a lot of the people who live their lives according to the Mishnah Brura choose to be very strict. That's their choice. That's their community's choice. But he really set things up to be, again, accessible to the everybody. So that's his work that really put him on the map, because it was a work that was beautiful, important, everyday speech, how we talk about each other, and really accessible, even if it was taken as at times strict. But his other magnum opus that was written over a number of years, 1884 to 1907, and again, he wrote so much other stuff in the interim and afterwards, was a work called the Mishnah Berurah. And Mishnah literally means the repetition, and Berurah means clear. And you can see a hint there of going all the way back from the Mishnah from the 3rd century, which compiled all of the different rabbinic debates going on around the Roman times, to Rambam's Mishnah Torah, a repetition of the Torah, where he tried to say, well, the Mishnah was hundreds of years ago, but I finally perfected the Mishnah. This is the teaching that we all need. To now the Mishnah Brura, which is he's saying, this is a work that everybody can have on their shelves, and use it for most cases in Jewish life. And again, in many cases, that still holds true today. In fact, Lake Park Synagogue has a complete Hebrew English translation of his Mishnah Berurah. It's in my office. Anyone is welcome to take a look at it. It is written as a direct commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. However, he didn't just go to the Shulchan Aruch and comment on that. What he had is from 1563 until 1884, he had several hundred years of other Ashkenazi rabbis writing their opinions, their casework, living, everything like that. He had all of that to look at and then come to some practical rulings. And in fact, the first thing that we're going to look at is why he felt he needed to write a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Why can't you just read the Shulchan Aruch and be done with it? So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this is from again, there's so many different things I can refer to as that. I'm just going to start calling him the Chofetz Chayim from now till the end of the class, because that's the most popular way to refer to him, but you all know his many names. So this is from his introduction to the Mishnah Berurah. So please, Jane.
Shulchan Aruch, also with learning the Torah along with it, is an obscure book, since when the Bet Yosef ordered the Shulchan Aruch, his intention was that one would first learn the essential laws and their sources from the Torah and the Bet Yosef in order to understand the ruling, each one according to its reasoning. Since the Torah and the Bet Yosef bring numerous differing opinions for each law, he thus decided to write the Shulchan Aruch to make known the ruling and practice for each law. It was not his intention, however, that we would learn it alone, since the law is not able to sit well with a person unless he understands the reasoning behind it.
Thank you. If somebody's reading a book on physics, a textbook, and they read the whole long complex chapter, and at the end they have summary, here are the takeaways, that's great. You break your teeth over the main content, and the summary kind of brings it all together and helps for review. If somebody in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century is lucky enough to have the skill set, intellect, and money to own an entire set of the Beit Yosef commentary on the Torah, Rav Yosef Kairo's commentary on the Torah, with the Shulchan Aruch, they can do is they can study any particular thing, study the whole section, might be pages upon pages, then look at the Shulchan Aruch to kind of summarize, oh, I see what to do now. The Chofetz Chaim's point is, nobody can do that. The vast majority of people can't do that. Rabbis can do that, but the Shulchan Aruch was written for the lay person, but it's not practicable for the lay person. The lay person can't read the Shulchan Aruch and actually know what to do. So what does he do? He says, I'm going to take the Shulchan Aruch as a jumping off point and write my commentary so that someone can read the Shulchan Aruch, and then my fairly brief, not super short, but fairly straightforward commentary that will allow someone to get to the practical ruling. And again, we'll look at an article that talks about how he got there. But again, it's in some ways, it's kind of a criticism, because Rav Yosef Kairo presented the Shulchan Aruch as anybody can pick this up and, figure out what to do. And he says, that's not the way it works. To actually live your life according to it, you need to have way, way more, and that's not reasonable. But with my handy dandy Mishnah Berurah, you could actually do that. And by the way, the entire Mishnah, he actually wrote several commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. His main one was the Mishnah Berurah, which is the practical ruling. And then he wrote one which is a little bit more in depth called the Biur Halacha, the clarification of the law. We'll actually see a sample of that below. And he had a few other things on the page, but his entire work, his entire commentary with his multiple ones, it's about 5 volumes. I have it on my shelf. There's an index, and I've absolutely picked the volume off the shelf, said, oh, that's the one I need. And within less than 5 minutes, I've looked up things before. Now, again, it's been a couple decades now, at least, since he finished this work. So there are other things that have come up, but this work really does accomplish what he wanted it to do, which is to give people his clear guidance of what he thinks we should do and valid options in different situations. One of the most famous ones that I mentioned, I think in the last class, is about making china kosher. Ceramic china is generally, the consensus is that one of the materials that can't be made kosher after it's been cooked with treif on it is china, because it's just too fine, etc. But he does say, however, if somebody is not wealthy, they cannot afford to buy new dishes, then there is an opinion they can rely on to make it kosher. And I remember one of my rabbis, I asked him about this, and he said, today you can go into Target or Walmart, maybe not Walmart because their stock is failing, but you can go into one of these stores and buy a whole new set of dishes for practically next to nothing. Therefore, it's hard to say that you can be lenient because most people can afford new dishes. But that's an example of the Mishnah Brura saying, ideally, this is the ruling. But in the real world, sometimes you can be a little bit lenient. But the Shulchan Aruch doesn't always give you a clear sense of what the ruling actually is. Now, one of the really important things here is that the Shulchan Aruch was written in 4 sections: daily laws, daily prayer and holidays. That's 1. 2 is things about kashrut, mourning, and just all kinds of stuff that does come up throughout our lives, but not all the time. And the 3rd section is on marriage, and the 4th is on civil laws. The Mishnah Berurah, the Chofetz Chayim, only wrote on the 1st section. You want to know about Shabbos, you want to know about the Amidah and prayer and Shema, Chofetz Chaim's got you covered. You want to know about the laws of marriage, you got to look elsewhere. Why did he write specifically on that? It could be that they're the most common laws that people ask about. Generally, when there's a funeral, a rabbi's going to get involved. When there's a wedding, a rabbi's going to get involved. When there's a case of civil law and suing someone who broke your motorcycle, you go to a rabbinic court. But the laws that the average person does need to look up is, it's Shabbat and you're setting the table and you haven't made the egg salad. Can you make egg salad? That's why he wrote it. He did cover some of the other topics, such as the laws of proper speech in specific volumes, but his magnum opus is written for the people. I want to say for the people, by the people. Now, before we go on to the next section, are there any questions up until now? Beautiful. So this next section here, and I'll break it up, is an article by Rabbi Michael J. Broyd. He teaches at Emory. He's involved in a number of organizations, and his article is just brilliant. He's written so many important articles on the history and development of Jewish law. However, the Chofetz Chaim is known as being one of the most ethical people in history. Rabbi Michael J. Broyd, this is not to besmirch his name, but he's had some challenges with ethics. I will not discuss them here, but it's interesting to read about them. And despite that, his scholarship is still respected. I say that, so if somebody says, you're bringing in Michael J. Broyd, do you know what he did? I do know what he did. And I think that he has to deal with some of the ethical lapses that he had, but again, he didn't really hurt anybody per se, but his scholarship is without question. And he wrote this incredible article that you can actually find online. It's about 35 pages, not at all overwhelming, on the methodology of the Chofetz Chaim's Mishnah Berurah. And I brought just a number of selections that I think will really help us understand how the Chofetz Chaim decided what is Jewish law. When people say, Rabbi, what do I do? This is how he decided. So Susan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this is a big section, so I'll break it up for a number of readers. But one of the first parts I brought here is he kind of outlines the different kind of works that people were writing in regards to Jewish law. And then we're going to think about, where does the Mishnah Berurah fit in? So go ahead, please, Susan.
Until the late 1800s, works of halakha generally fell into one of 4 distinct categories. The first category comprises works such as the Arba Turim and the Beit Yosef, collections of halachic opinion with the occasional conclusive decision. The second category, exemplified by the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Torah, consists of works which clearly delineate the laws without commentary or explanation. The intention of these works is to provide an easy guidebook for proper action. Some, like the Mishnah Torah, are meant to stand independent of any other works. Others, such as the Shulchan Aruch, are meant for younger students and for quick review. Okay, independent of other works, such as the Shulchan Aruch. Well, then they're let's see, they stand independent. They are meant for younger students and for quick review, yet presuppose that its audience will look elsewhere for greater in-depth analysis. The third category, in which the Ramah's glosses on the Shulchan Aruch and the Ravad's glosses on the Mishnah Torah are included, contain primarily editorial-like super commentaries which add or correct information. The fourth category contains works such as the Yam Shel Shlomo, which attempt to collect all relevant information on a topic from the Talmud to contemporary times in order to evaluate the subject properly and determine the correct decision.
Pause there for a moment.
Influence.
So I was
Okay.
just going to say this paragraph is great because since the time of exile and Jews are all over the world and, figuring out how are we going to do Jewish law, this paragraph kind of encapsulate all the different kinds of legal works that have been attempted for the people. And some of them are meant for learning, some of them are meant for review, and some of them are meant for picking off your shelf and figuring out the ruling. Now, the Mishnah Berurah doesn't fit easily into any one of these categories. He's probably the closest to this fourth category, which is kind of bringing all the relevant opinions and telling you which one to do, but he's not exhaustive or encyclopedic. Like I said, he actually brings 3 or 4 different commentaries on this page, and each one has a different purpose. His Mishnah Berurah, the most popular one, the most important one, more or less tells you practically what to do and explains it. His Biur Halacha goes more in depth and mentions how he got to the decision, and he has another one that kind of mentions all these other sources that you can look up on your own to learn more in depth. So what he kind of tries to do is capture really all of this. In some ways, he does all of these commentaries on one page by breaking them up into different, sections on the page, which is quite brilliant. So it's a one-stop shop. So it's another reason his work was so popular. There's another work that'll be mentioned called the Aruch HaShulchan, which is incredible, but it brings, it throws in everything in the kitchen sink. It traces everything. So to get to one ruling, you have to read 5 pages of the complete history. If you're learning, for the sake of learning in a yeshiva, and you want to read the history, it's the greatest book ever. His conclusions are brilliant, but to get there is a slog. With the Mishnah Berurah, you go to the page, you read the Shulchan Aruch, you read the Mishnah Berurah, you can close the book and know what to do. If you're curious to learn more, you read Biur Halacha. If you're curious to learn even more, again, you can choose to go more and more in depth, but all of his pieces are in conversation and build on each other. So it's quite brilliant. So Susan, I'll have you take a little bit more, but like I said, one of the ways to understand the importance of the Chofetz Chaim and why he became the king, even to this day, many Orthodox communities will say that they're basically their main source, at least for daily prayer and holidays, is still the Mishnah Berurah. And again, even I, Rabbi Dinan, will often turn to him in certain cases, or at least people who generally hold by him. So go ahead, Susan, where it says the influence of 2 halachic giants. And again, understanding him in comparison to the other major scholar writing a work of Jewish law around the same time, exact same time, actually.
Okay, the influence of 2 halachic giants from the end of the 19th century remains strong to this day. The first, Rabbi Yechiel Epstein, was the author of the Aruch HaShulchan, a novel and innovative work, not a nonfiction, with the simple organizational structure, which is grounded in the Talmud and classical post-Talmudic codes. On the methodological level, the Aruch HaShulchan is a fairly simple work. It has only 2 principles: Talmudic correctness and contemporary practice in Lita.
Which is in
that's Lithuania.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Other opinions are rejected simply as wrong, and the complexity of the work is limited to determining Talmudic correctness, no small feat, and harmonizing that with Minhag Lita.
So pause there for a moment. Going back actually to Rabbi Moshe Isserles in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, oftentimes what he said is, here's the, this is what the Rav Yosef Karo said. However, this is the custom in our lands. Now, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, as I had mentioned in the last class on him, would often say, there are multiple valid opinions. However, this is our custom in the land, but by writing it in that way, it opens the door for others to disagree with him, and that was an incredible and I think good decision. But the Aruch HaShulchan, which many, particularly in the modern Orthodox world, say is more authoritative because of the way it was written, he is, closes the door a little bit more. And also, it seems like he's right. He is a shul rabbi, as it'll mention here. He was in a synagogue, so he was really writing for his community. So, for example, when I write the weekly newsletter and a holiday's coming up, and I'm kind of reviewing the customs, I'm writing for Lake Park Synagogue. If I feel like it's appropriate for my synagogue to be a more lenient on something, or I would like to push it to be more strict, whatever it is, I'm writing for my congregants. Now, I don't know that he specifically wanted it to be that focused, but in some ways, it's written that way. It seems like he was writing for his community, not just his shul, but in many ways he was. Now, again, his work is brilliant and beautiful, but he tries to keep it very focused, not as much as the Mishnah Torah. He definitely brings all the total explanation from Torah until he wrote it about how we got there, but he ends on a pretty final note. This is our custom here, and in our town, that's perfect. Whereas the Mishnah Berurah, as I'll mention here, could be used more universally, at least for European Ashkenazim, which in many ways, shape, and form, we still are today. So that was the Aruch HaShulchan, which is still an incredibly important work today, but did not gain the universal acceptance that the Mishnah Berurah did. Gloria, if I could ask you to take over here at the second, I'll zoom in a wee bit, the second giant, please.
The second giant and the methodological opposite to Rabbi Epstein is Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan of Radin, the author of the Mishnah Berurah. At the foundational level, the Mishnah Berurah assumes that virtually all disputes of Jewish law and Talmudic understanding are irresolvable. Correct practice is therefore difficult to discern, and the defense of custom is not a sole justification for Jewish law. Moreover, according to Rabbi Kagan, the Shulchan Aruch, the supposed set table of easily understood rulings for daily practice, is not really as clear-cut as Rabbi Yosef Karo asserted. Rabbi Kagan, therefore, decided to write a jurisprudential masterpiece so as to elucidate for the layperson and legal scholar alike, but both what should be the normative halachic practice and why it should be so, both for complicated halachic matters and for simple practices of daily life, in order to balance opposing forces of tradition and modernity. The Mishnah Berurah attempts to provide definitive halachic guidance to every question of Jewish law based on four central questions. 1, what is the common halachic practice of the community in a given situation? Does more than one minhag exist? 2, what is the spectrum of answers provided by the poskim to the question at hand? 3, what are the minimum halachic requirements one should try to fulfill? 4, how can one maximize observance in order to enhance his relationship with God?
Thank you. And that last one is so unbelievably important and is representative and reflective of the holiness and the righteousness. Is again, his goal here wasn't just let me be very technical and textual and figure out what the right correct ruling is. And there are rabbis who absolutely do that. For him, he is again thinking about how the practice of this law will influence and affect people. And if it's a financial thing, putting a great financial burden on someone and saying you have to throw out everything in your kitchen will not bring them closer to God. If anything, it'll push them away. It'll make it more difficult. So when a leniency will allow someone to practice Shabbat or Kashrut better, that actually, as long as it's a valid opinion, go for it, he would say. He might say, we should strive to be more strict when possible, but that's only because he feels that those who are able to be strict and to keep the law to a higher level, he feels that if they're able to, that might bring them closer to God and make their life more holy. But that's such a foundational principle. But essentially what he does here is, not essentially, but what he does here is he wants to lay out everything before him. And unlike Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who would often say to Rav Yosef Cairo, I hear what you're doing, but this is our custom and therefore it's proper for us. That's not enough for the Chofetz Chaim. What he says is, let's look at the customs, but why are these the customs? What are the sources for it? And not just what are the sources for it, but why? And he will dig, and again, that's why he wrote multiple different commentaries on one page, because to do all of that in one work, again, it would take 30 pages to get to your point. So he says, here's my point, here's how I got here, and if you want to look more, here you go. And it's such a brilliant pedagogical, and again, for the lay person, and especially now it's in English, pretty much anyone could pick it up, figure out what to do. And as you go up in your intellectual, not your intellectual level, but in your learning, as you want to dig deeper, you can learn more and more with the Chofetz Chaim's Mishnah Berurah, which is really incredible. So he looks at all the different things at hand. and he figures out what he feels should be the best practice. And we'll look at some of his principles about how he gets there. But two statements here that are really important. One is where he says the Shulchan Aruch is not enough. We saw him write that in the Mishnah Berurah. This Rabbi Broid isn't making that claim out of nowhere. The Chofetz Chayim himself wrote it in his introduction. The Shulchan Aruch is not enough. You need a massive commentary with it. It's not practicable. But the other thing he said is, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as the Jewish law. There are multiple different and valid practices, and to figure out what the correct one is really isn't possible. So we have to figure out which one makes the most sense based on the 10 principles that are going to be laid out here that Rabbi Broid kind of teases out. But that's such a beautiful and constructive and positive way to approach Jewish law, is that there's no such thing as wrong. In fact, if you look back at the Talmud, back to the debates between the academies of Hillel and Shammai, they're arguing, and a heavenly voice comes down and says, Elu ve'elu dvarim Elokim Chayim. These words and these words are all the words of the Holy God, meaning you're right and you're right. And how does that joke end? You're also right to the third person. But unless God comes down and tells us, or Moshe the prophet, or Eliyahu the prophet comes down and tells us what the correct practice is, it's in our hands to figure out. And by the way, I'm referring to an explicit conversation in the Talmud about how we figure out Jewish law in the absence of prophetic and God's voice. And Mishnah Berurah says, yeah, that's the reality we live in. So for anyone to say this is the definitive law, they don't know what they're talking about. But if I can defend a practice and explain why I think it's the one that we should do, then I think that's a valid way to approach Jewish law. And again, like Rabbi Moshe Isserlis before him, it opens the door for disagreement. He will rule leniencies. So you could say, oh, the Mishnah Berurah one time literally says the words, Tov lihiyot machmir, it's good to be machmir. You have to look in the context of that. It's good to be strict, by the way, is what machmir means. It's good to be strict. And sometimes, yes, and sometimes it's fine to be lenient. So you could choose all the strict opinions of the Mishnah Berurah and say he was an ultra-Orthodox Haredi rabbi. Fine, that's what you could get out of it. You could also read it and live your life according to all his leniencies if it's appropriate for you and your community. And that's also according to his work. That's the beauty of it. He opens the door to learn his work and come to different conclusions. That is what Jewish law should be. If you go to a store and you buy the book that's the Laws of Blessings, that is it's a really fun work. And again, it helps somebody to figure out what blessings to say, but it's kind of misleading because there's no one exact practice of how and when to say blessings. There are multiple practices and each community has to kind of figure it out. Now, again, most people don't have the time to do that. So a community picks their Mishnah Berurah or they pick their rabbi. That's totally valid. But the way he wrote his work is he opened the door for the conversation to continue. And these are his 10 main principles as Rabbi Broid delineates, but you can easily, I'm not going to do it here because it would take forever, you can find examples of each of these, and I'll bring an example of one at the end, which kind of ties back to something we talked about in previous classes. But before we go to his methodology, we'll just kind of bullet point through the list. Any questions up until now? Excellent. So again, this is Rabbi Broid's take, but you can really find examples of all of these. So this is what it seems that both based on the Chofetz Chaim's introduction, you can figure these out from there and look at him literally explaining himself in certain cases. This is how I came to this decision. So Rabbi Broid is truly a scholar and a master of the work. So that's how we figure these out. So one, relevance, to interpret rules in ways that are relevant to contemporary society. Really, really important. And again, that means that if your contemporary society is different, then you can learn from the Chofetz Chaim that you should rule differently. Two, more or less, to provide a framework which allows one to follow minimal requirements in times of stress so that at least the basic framework of halachic life is maintained, yet to demand more stringent requirements when possible in order to have a more holistic approach to the halacha. That's so important. Someone, again, can choose the more strict opinions and say, that's the Mishnah Berurah, but no, he says, how much matzah do you have to eat? If you've eaten this amount, you fulfilled your obligation. Ideally, eat more, but if somebody can't, that's fine. And that's so important for a synagogue rabbi who's trying to do an event for people from all different walks of life, but I'd like to try and create a custom where everyone fulfills at least the basics and it's totally valid, the Mishnah Berurah comes along and says, this is the absolute minimum, but it's totally kosher. It's so important that he rules that way in many cases. 3, both right. To demand adherence that is consistent with more than one position if both are reasonable. That's actually a principle that many rabbis throughout history, thousands of years, have tried to do. If you have differing opinions, can I make them work together so that if they seem to disagree with each other, it'd be obviously easier if we saw examples, but sometimes there are opinions that seem to disagree. And in fact, we will see an opinion at the end of opinions that seem to disagree, but he says it's actually possible to hold by both of them simultaneously. 4, avoidance. To avoid situations that result in trying to negotiate between conflicting priorities. Again, it'd be easier with an example, but he's trying to not put people in a position where they're figuring out, oh, if I do this, then I go against this principle, etc. So he says, choose a third option. Do the prayer, and if it says you're supposed to do it early, you're supposed to do it late, do it in the middle so that you don't have to worry about it being too late or too early. That could be an example of it. 5, be strict, machmir. To be strict when Jewish law authorities are stringent, even if lenient customs have developed. So that's an important thing that a lot of people do pick up on the Mishnah Berurah. If he looks at the practice, and for the last 500 years, even though technically you could be lenient, everyone has been strict in saying you have to drink, technically you could drink, an ounce of grape juice to fulfill the kiddush or whatever, but really everyone says you should drink a lot more. He's going to rule that you should drink more. If you push him, would he technically say, yes, it's enough to drink less? Yeah. But he would say, if the custom has developed to be strict, then we should do that. That's not the same as him trying to create a society of people being strict for no reason. That's him trying to work within the customs. However, there are times when he says, be lenient, to not protest against well-established lenient customs, even if the individual may personally lead towards stringency as a matter of belief or interpretation. And this is really important. If he says, for the last 500 years, everybody says you have to drink 17 gallons of wine for the 4 cups at the Pesach Seder, there's a lenient opinion that's valid. It's on the books that says you could drink a few ounces per cup. Don't protest. Why? Because it's still a part of Jewish law of the corpus. And that's one of the big things that I want to take away, is that Jewish law is a range of opinions. And again, at the end of the day, you look at your community so you can figure out what to practically do. But all of Jewish law exists within a range, within a spectrum, and we need to validate, recognize, and respect wherever people are within that range. Unsupported customs. To protest against following customs that are not based on Jewish tradition, are not recorded, or erroneous. Now, this is something that I am a big fan of. I'm not going to pick on any here, but I've mentioned in the past certain things that have become a custom, throwing bread at Tashley. And we have not only zero sources for it, but we have countless rabbis through generations who are opposed to it. And he's going to say, don't do it. Now, people, usually when that happens, people ignore him. When Rabbi Dinan says this is not the custom and it shouldn't be, and everybody's against it, people ignore me too, which is just a proof that no matter how brilliant or how many sources you have, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much I cry from the mountains. All that matters is what the people do. And in fact, Ashkenazi rabbis, as I mentioned in earlier class, are particularly sensitive to that. At some point, they'll say, you know what, the people are wrong. What the people are doing, I don't see a basis for. It seems to be wrong, but if the people do it, somehow it must be right. And they're my people, I'm among them, so I'll find a way to defend them. And I'll find a way to validate what they're doing, even if I can see zero validation for it. But he says if there's zero sources for it, it's hard to defend it. Explanation. 8, to explain why unsupported customs might be permissible. Oh, that's literally what I just said. As an Ashkenazi rabbi, even if he's against it, he's still going to defend it because you love the people. The whole point of Jewish law is it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean anything unless the people embrace it. This is usually done as a limud zchut, a learning for merit, an attempt to judge favorably those who appear to be acting in the wrong, undertaken in order to create harmony and respect among different groups, even when he disagrees with their approach. I try and do that. Rav Moshe Feinstein, who I think we might be learning in a future class, if not I'll have it, did that a lot. And again, that is a uniquely, not totally uniquely, but Ashkenazi rabbis do that a lot, which is everybody's crazy. I have no idea what they're doing, but I'm going to defend them anyways, because that's what you do. You take care of your own, you respect them, even if you think they're wrong. That's a beautiful idea that is reflected in his work and many Ashkenazi rabbis, and I do it as well. Mysticism and halakha, we'll come back to this one as well. To minimize the inherent tensions between Kabbalah, mystic things, particularly customs in the Zohar, and Talmud, even as such interpretations may seem somewhat forced. However, when faced with no alternative, the Talmud does take precedence. So again, we'll see an example of that at the end. It's not super complicated, but at the end of the day, the Zohar, which as far as he's concerned, he probably considered it to be an ancient work going back to the first, second, or third century. However, because it was discovered so much later, whether or not it was written later, the established Talmud that has defined Jewish law for 1,500 years, up until the moment when the Chofetz Chayim wrote his work, the Talmud definitely takes precedence. However, if they mention two practices about, again, we'll see one below, let's say the Talmud says, when you're standing in prayer, hold up your right hand. The Zohar says, hold up your left hand. Well, what's a way to do it is hold up both your hands. Again, I don't think that's an actual thing, but you'll see the source below. But if he can make them work together, he will. But when they are in conflict and there's no resolution, the Talmud wins. However, there are certain rabbis, like the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Cairo, where he might disagree. And he might say the Zohar wins, or the weird dream prophecies he had win, for those who were in those classes, about how the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Cairo, sometimes ruled. So important and relevant today. And the 10th one, tension. To incorporate the position of the Gra. The Gra is this rabbi, the Vilna Gaon, who was this great sage from Vilnius, which is where the Chofetz Chaim learned in his early years. Despite that the fact that the Gra's true versus false approach is diametrically opposed to the Mishnah Berurah's inclusive and holistic priorities, in which alternative views are rarely fully wrong. Now, to really understand this, you need to read the full article by Rabbi Breuer to know more about the Gra. But simply put, this is kind of what I said about the Aruch HaShulchan, is the approach that there are correct positions and there are wrong positions. That is not how the Mishnah Berurah views Jewish law. There are positions that we follow, and there are other positions that could also be followed, but I think you should do this one. And that is a very honest, respectful, and practical approach. The Gra did not often approach it that way. However, he was still in conversation, or the Chofetz Chaim was still in conversation with the works and rulings of the Gra. So these are all of the different things. And by the way, again, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan mentions all of these in different contexts. This is why I came to this ruling, because of this principle. There's an explicit one I'm not bringing where he explains explicitly why Zohar versus Talmud and which one wins. All of this can be found in his work. He explains his methodology as he goes along, and that's one of the beauties of his work. He tells you how he got from A to B. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan does as well. However, the conclusions of the Mishnah Berurah often open up the door to a little bit more debate and more variation, and can be applied in more broad communities. A big difference I didn't mention, though, the Mishnah Berurah only writes, as I said, on one section of the Shulchan Aruch, prayers and holidays. The Aruch HaShulchan writes on the whole thing. So you could say, fine, Mishnah Berurah for Shabbat, but the Aruch HaShulchan for weddings, for kashrut, for civil cases, etc., like that. And a lot of people will look to him till that. But this is the way that the Mishnah Berurah approached his work. And again, it was so important for him that you saw that. You saw his process. And again, my emphasis here is that his process recognized that there's more than one right solution. And you, me, we all deserve to know how we got there. And if you disagree with him, he gave you the tools to be able to come up with a different ruling. And now again, today, people often just follow by what he says, but his work will be relevant for generations to come. So before we conclude with a quick example of how he applies a few of his principles, any questions up until now? Beautiful. So this last one is a small one. People may or may not have even seen this practice. So again, Rav Yosef Cairo in his Shulchan Aruch makes this ruling, which is not found in the Talmud. He says that one should, during the Amidah, the 18 blessings or 19 blessings today, we added one for the building of the temple, one should bend one's head a little so that one's eyes will be downwards to the ground, and one should consider oneself as if one is standing in the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and in one's heart, one should direct oneself upward towards the heaven. It sounds very, very, very lovely. And he mentions elsewhere about closing one's eyes. So the question is it enough to look down, or does one also have to close one's eyes? And the question is this thing about closing one's eyes, so I didn't bring the whole thing here. We mentioned about closing eyes elsewhere, but it doesn't say anywhere in the Talmud about closing eyes. So does that mean in the Shulchan Aruch where he says you have to close your eyes, does that mean when we do the Amidah, we have to keep our eyes closed? That would make it pretty hard for most people to do the Amidah who don't know it by heart. So I'm actually skipping over his Mishnah Brura commentary and going to his Biur Halacha, because there he goes a little bit more in depth about his methodology and his process. So he says, the Chofetz Chayim says, there's no ruling in the Talmud that forbids leaving one's eyes open, i.e. the Talmud does not say you have to leave your eyes closed. So where does it happen? Rather just that one's eyes should look down. So there is a source in the Shulchan Aruch for looking down. Now again, that's not a big deal. Most of us look down when we're looking in our Siddur. Okay, accept that. But again, the Shulchan Aruch later says you have to have your eyes closed. But it appears that the Holy Zohar, so he has a lot of respect for the Zohar, disagrees with our Talmud. It seems the ruling of the Zohar, which in the Zohar itself says one needs to have their eyes closed. So is that what we have to do? The Talmud doesn't mention closing your eyes, it just mentions looking down. But the Zohar says you have to close your eyes. And the Shulchan Aruch says look down and close your eyes. So what do? It seems the ruling of the Zohar is specifically about when one is looking around at things that might be distracting. So everybody should look down. But if there are things like someone next to you playing on their phone or rats running around, whatever it is like that are constantly distracting you, then close your eyes. Now, I don't know if that's what the Zohar meant, but here's what he's doing. He sees a conflict between what the Zohar says and what the Talmud says. But what he's going to do is explain the intention, give intention to the Zohar. The Zohar didn't care about whether your eyes were closed. The Zohar cared about whether you were distracted or not. Again, that's not what the Zohar says. The Zohar says close your eyes. The Shulchan Aruch says close your eyes. But if he goes back to the Zohar and says, let me figure out what it was really trying to say, and it's about getting distracted. But when one is looking down at the ground and not at other things, it is permitted for his eyes or her eyes to be open. And there's no disagreement at all. In any case, ideally, one should be stringent to close one's eyes. So what he's done here is, Zohar says close your eyes. Talmud says look down. The Zohar doesn't explain itself. I don't know if the Talmud explains itself, but it seems that both of them are about distraction. So if you're looking down according to the Talmud, which that's a real strong source, then you don't have to worry about being distracted. You don't have to close your eyes. So we have not rejected the Zohar. When do you follow the Zohar in the Shulchan Aruch? When you're getting distracted. But what is the last thing he says? But it's good to be strict in this case anyways, if possible. So if you know the Amidah by heart, then just to keep all, and again, this goes back to his principles, if you want to cover all your bases and follow the Talmud's looking down and the Zohar's closed eyes, ideally do that if you're able to. But if you're not, you need to look at your Siddur like myself as well, then you can have your eyes closed down. Just make sure you're not distracted. So if somebody's doing the Amidah by heart in the middle of Yosemite, and they're looking out at nature and they keep seeing birds and animals, then nobody's happy. The Zohar is not happy. The Talmud is not happy. Shulchan Aruch is not happy. And the Chofetz Chayim is not happy. But what he's done here is he's found a conflict in the Talmud and Zohar, created an explanation which may or may not be the reason behind it, and found a way for all of them to coexist while validating that you can also be lenient and keep your eyes open as long as you're not distracted. So we've seen him here apply multiple of his principles in one simple ruling. So for those of you who are, okay, practically, Rabbi, what does that mean? I'll open it up to you, Gloria. Do you have to keep your eyes closed during the Shulchan Aruch? Or sorry, during the Amiyad? Must they be closed?
No.
If you're going to be distracted by having your eyes open, should you try and close your eyes?
I guess so, yes.
But practically speaking, now that you have the methodology, the underlying thing is distracting. What's a better option? Rather than closing your eyes, is to keep your eyes where? In the
prayer book.
In the siddur. There you go. He gave you all of the tools, the motivation, the sources, valid rulings. He gave you all the tools to figure out the ruling. So if somebody knows the Amidah by heart, try and satisfy everybody. But as long as you're not getting distracted, there's multiple ways to do it. That's the beauty of the Mishnah Berurah. And again, I wish he had written on all 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. And what's curious, there are other rabbis that have tried to do this for the other sections of the Mishnah Berurah. None of them have captured it. None of them have come close. There's no one who's, there are other incredible rabbis today. There's never been a Chofetz Chayim. And that's why his work is still as relevant today. Yes, he passed away in the 30s, so this isn't 500 years ago, but his work was written in such a way that it will be relevant for generations to come, much like the Shulchan Aruch was organized in a way that even if you don't agree with all the rulings, he created a beautiful groundwork to grow off of. That's what these 3 classes are all about, is rabbis building on each other, and more importantly, opening the doors for the next generation to disagree, add on, and amend to them. And what's great is this conversation is far from closed. And there's a danger of these books being published that say, these are the laws of kashrut. No, kashrut is a complex, ongoing thing. But at the same time, the metach, the tension between that is, I need to know if I buy a chicken or if I buy a potter, how to keep my kitchen kosher. I can't learn all of these sources. So every once in a while, you meet a Mishnah Berurah. You need an art scroll, Laws of Kashrut, for the practical person. But if somebody wants to dig a little deeper, it's really at your fingertips because of great men like the Mishnah Berurah. So if you want to learn more, it's accessible. But at the end of the day, if you want a practical ruling, the Mishnah Berurah did it all on one page. And again, we have a complete English translation of it at the synagogue. And I encourage everyone to go pick up a copy and just peruse it and see the beauty of what he did.